So welcome to another Rational Basis. I'm John DePippa. I'm joined by Judge Wendell Griffen, and we want to talk today about really two things happening this week. One is we're 1 year into Trump 2.0, but we also commemorated Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday this week. And I think we'd like to touch on those to the extent that they are connected, but also to the extent that they each say something important about who we are and where we're going. So, Judge Griffen, let's talk. You and I beforehand were talking about Dr. King and his critique in his speech in April about the Vietnam War beyond Vietnam. And I think it's a really crucial part of his legacy that gets sanitized by a lot of white commentators. So let's begin there.
Thank you, Dean DePippa. On April 4, 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke to an assembly of concerned laity and clergy about Vietnam at Riverside Church in New York City. And the title of his speech was Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence. I encourage anyone who hasn't done so to look up that speech and read the text. You can also hear an audio version of it. But the summary of it is that Dr. King not only called for an end to the U.S. involvement and military involvement in Southeast Asia and end of its bombing in Vietnam, but also said that beyond Vietnam, we need to look at the nature, the structure of the United States. And he called for what he said was a radical revolution of values to address three, what he called triplets: racism, militarism, and crass materialism. That speech was prescient. And we are now in 2026, almost, it's hard to believe it, almost 50 years ago. But we are now looking at the fact that the United States, since Vietnam, has been in wars in Iraq twice, in Afghanistan. It has invaded Venezuela most recently. It is funding the war that the Israelis are conducting in Gaza, and it's threatening war in Greenland, and is now brought war from the outer world into the streets of New York, of Minnesota,
Mhm.
brought troops to Chicago, brought troops to Los Angeles. We have become what Dr. King warned us
Yes.
against.
Well, and certainly you see, particularly in what's happening with the so-called mass deportations and the deployment of troops, the perfect storm of those triplets that Dr. King talked about, of racism, militarism, and a revolution in values. Because each of those, I think, contributes to the climate. I mean, it's no accident that, for example, in Minnesota, the whole thing is being spurred by so-called corrupt Somalis, that we're now seeing really militarized law enforcement, if you can call ICE agents law enforcement. And we see the kind of cratering of values, um, the kind of dehumanization that so many on the right want to participate in when they look at the killing of Renee Good, but also the brutality that's happening when ICE agents deport and rip citizens out of their house in cold weather with almost nothing on. All those three things are contributing to what we're seeing today, not just in Minnesota, but in other countries around, in other cities around the country.
Dean DePippo, you and I are constitutional scholars, and you know full well that what we are seeing is what fascism is about, which is what we talked about our
Mm-hmm.
last program. Is this also not a fair commentary on the first year of the second Trump administration?
Well, it is, and certainly you can think about those triplets as contributing to the rise of Trump. And the longer he stays in the public eye, the more obvious those three things become. But what always struck me was in the campaign when he said, well, I want to be a dictator for day one. Well, no, he doesn't. He wanted to be a dictator, period. And he learned his lesson from the first Trump administration. And we have wisely or unwisely invested the modern day president with lots of discretionary powers. Congress, for example, essentially has given up the tariff authority to the president, but also the Constitution vests the president in a lot of unilateral authority, pardons, for example, appointments, and a large control over appointments and removal. What you've seen the Trump presidency do in the past year is consolidate the legal parts of his job, turning into a dictator, but also pushing the limits beyond the legal limits. You see the way he's threatening and bullying Greenland, deploying troops to various cities, even though he keeps losing in court. They keep going back and doing the same thing. And so he was never going to be a dictator just day one. He wants to be a dictator, and he is being a dictator throughout today and into tomorrow.
Do you think that the third branch, the judiciary, will continue to be, or maybe I should rephrase the question, will be an effective break or check, I suppose is the proper word, check on what we have seen?
Sure. Well, let's. I think we have to distinguish between the lower courts, lower federal courts, and the Supreme Court. The lower federal courts have thrown a lot of sand in the gears. And the president loses about 90% of the time in the lower court. And there are hundreds of cases where he has lost, where he's been forced to rehire people or send money back or stop doing things. The Supreme Court, on the other hand, has used what's called the shadow docket. These are supposed to be emergency rulings to rule in favor of Trump 90% of the time. And so if the question is, are the lower courts a check on his authority? Yes. Has the Supreme Court been? Not very effectively. And they're preparing to give the president the authority essentially to control the entire executive branch, including independent agencies. So again, we have to think about Supreme Court, lower courts, and I think there's a real problem, some lower court judges have pointed out, between the way the Supreme Court treats the lower courts right now.
The concern of independency of the federal agencies raises the issue of the Federal Reserve now, because, as you know, not only has the judiciary, the Department of Justice indicted or threatened indictments against Lisa Cook, Federal Reserve member Lisa Cook, but there is a subpoena has been issued to the Fed Chair Jerome Powell, who President Trump has not been able to bully into retiring or resigning, and Powell still has a year or two left on his term. So what do you think the Supreme Court might do? We have the Lisa Cook argument coming up.
That's
And
right.
I'm not trying to get too deep into the weeds, but I think that this is relevant to our conversation about
I
rational
think it
basis.
is relevant because to the extent that the court wants to approve what's called the unitary executive theory, which in short means we have one president and he's in charge of the executive branch totally without limit. They are likely to do two things. I think they're likely to say that independent agencies like the Federal Trade Commission are completely within presidential control. But they seem to be wanting to carve out an exception for the Federal Reserve Agency. Well, that's illogical. I mean, if one is in the president's control, the other has to be. But it shows, though, how the president has, one, used right-wing intellectuals to support this dictatorship. But two, you see how the president wants to use his power, wants to weaponize the Justice Department against people who disagree with him or his political enemies. And Lisa Cook is one of those people he's trying to remove after some threatened prosecution. But we've seen it with other people: Jerome Powell, James Comey, Mark Kelly, those other members of Congress who did those videos about obeying illegal orders. So the president is acting like a dictator, and he's using the powers of the presidency to do so. And no institution seems willing to stand up to him and stop him.
So we have this very, very uncomfortable situation where all three branches of government, the judiciary now,
Yeah.
as we just mentioned, Congress, which seems to be supine and enabling to the president, and the executive branch, which the president, under Article 2, has leadership over, totally under this dictatorial control. What's the hope for democracy?
That's a good question. And I think that brings us back to Dr. King, because I think Dr. King in the entire movement had to face that same kind of sense of not just hopelessness, but this intractable system. And I think the key to Dr. King in the civil rights movement was its investment in values. It's not enough just to talk policy. You have to also say, here are the values that we stand for. And you make the moral argument for why the system is corrupt and unjust and unfair. And then you couple that with political and social action. And I think that's our hope. I think the hope that you see people standing up to ICE. There's our local protest where every Thursday afternoon at 4:00 we gather. I think those are the things, coupled with an argument about the morality or the lack thereof. That's where our hope has to come from.
I can't help but note the irony that the President of the United States has kidnapped an authoritarian leader of Venezuela and now claims to be running Venezuela, but says he is doing so to liberate the people of Venezuela. And the President of the United States is threatening to investigate criminal charges against the mayor of Minneapolis and the democratically elected governor of Minnesota, while himself having done what he's done in Venezuela and having basically declared himself head of a board of peace that violates international norms and circumvents the United Nations. And as we are taping this, is in Davos, Switzerland, essentially browbeating EU leaders to kneel to his desires. So globally and domestically, President Trump is daring the nation and the world to challenge him, to defy him. That's what dictators do.
That's exactly what they do. I mean, and you look at him, and he's both a political dictator. He learned how to manipulate the powers of the presidency, but he's also a personal bully, a personal dictator. And he fuses those things into his politics, if you will. And so you saw him on the way to Davos, basically heckling the leaders of the free world and threatening to bully them if they didn't go along with him. He's just combined those things. And if you think about his approach, he has, as we started before, collapsed both the domestic and the foreign. His activities domestically are no different than the way he's acting in foreign affairs. They are part of the same impetus. They're part of the same logic. They're part of the same approach. He has the potential to destroy the Western alliance, but also to destroy, and this is not an exaggeration, I don't think, democracy and the rule of law in the United States?
I am concerned as you are. We are both people who are devoted to democracy,
Hmm.
devoted to the rule of law, and people of a certain faith. Uh, we believe somehow that morality matters
Yeah.
in public policy, and whether, no matter what one's religious belief may or may not be, and we're not talking about a religious creed of any kind, we're talking about the basic morality that it needs to underlie public policy in order for public policy to
Yeah.
be legitimate. In order for it to have moral legitimacy, public policy, however it is manifested, has to have some sense of moral authority.
Hmm.
And the moral authority has to be something higher, much higher than it is right because I have the power to bully it into being so.
That's right. Well, I mean, Dr. King talked about that. I mean, he certainly made frequent references to kind of the moral law. He hearkened back to Thomas Aquinas and natural law. And the idea, I think, as you pointed out quite clearly, is if public policy has any legitimacy, it has to be rooted in something beyond mere will and power. I mean, that's Nietzsche.
Yeah.
Nietzschean philosophy is if I've got the power, then I'm going to take advantage of it. I think, again, the message from Dr. King, and that's why it's so important right now to hear it, is that just because you have the power to do something doesn't mean you should. And there may be prudential reasons not to do something, but I think fundamentally we have to ask the question, is there a moral reason to do something, even if you have the power to do it? And that, sadly, is where tens of millions of people have just simply fallen off the train,
Mm.
simply forgotten that that's the most important question we should ask before we do anything.
That's what we tell our children.
That's right.
Not can you, but ought you.
Yeah.
And if you ought not, no matter how much power you have, you should not. Uh,
Yeah.
not because you're incapable, but because it would be unconscionable for you to do
Mm-hmm.
so. The challenge we have now is that Dr. King's notions of justice, and we keep going back to Dr. King,
Yeah.
which we believe are fundamental for respect or for political legitimacy for and democratic institutions, have been disregarded. Dr. King's holiday was almost not even recognized by President Trump until the very end of the day
Mm-hmm.
on the holiday itself. I mean, the holiday has been a holiday for the last 30 years in federal government. But this is the first president who went almost the entire day without even making a declaration.
That's right.
So have we come to a point where the nation, the nation's chief executive officer, is somehow allowed to trample all sense of values, to disregard the rule of law, to bully the weak and vulnerable, and to brag about it,
Mm-hmm. Yes.
and and then seem that this nation can be viewed as an honest broker in global affairs.
Well, and I think that last point really hits on it. Again, going back to Dr. King's triplets, the president is racist. He's now shown to be a militarist, and he's shown to have no values. And so you put those three together in one man. And as I said earlier, he's threatening the Western alliance because even though it wasn't perfect, it was held together by the promise of the United States to back at least democratic rule that favored the United States. But it was a rough bargain that seemed to work out. Now it's clear that our allies can't trust us. And in a world like that, nothing is secure, no one is secure. Um, I want to add something as of a personal note though about Dr. King's holiday. If you recall, Arkansas was one of the last states to make it a state holiday.
Yes.
And for years, it combined Dr. King and Robert E. Lee,
Yes.
as though somehow they were equivalent. About 11 years ago, it was the 2015 legislative session, a libertarian legislator, Nate Bell, proposed to remove Lee from the King holiday and make the King holiday a state holiday. And I think he, in a somewhat naive way, believed in the principles. He took a lot of heat for that. And one of the few people who stood by him, literally, was my wife, Karen,
Mm.
who was lobbying for the Catholic diocese. And there was a moment where she and Representative Bell were sitting at the table presenting the bill together, surrounded by a hostile crowd, some of whom were in Civil War regalia.
I recall.
And it's a picture I never forgot. Eventually, the holiday was adopted, but those two people together sort of planted that seed in the face of that opposition. So I just wanted to mention how proud I am of her for doing that, but also how it was a wake up call for so many of us to see that those people in the background still existed.
I want to close by reminding us, I mean, we've talked about these things, and there are people who say this is so strange.
Mm,
But as you and I were talking before we began our recording, for many people from marginalized, and I would say that, quote, backgrounds, this has not been an exception. This is simply the norm we have known,
that's right.
but it is now being experienced by a white and previously, if not naive, uh, unpersuaded majority.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Indigenous people have always known that the Dr. King's triplets have defined the system of this democracy, however imperfect it may be, and however lofty our goals may be. Formerly enslaved people like myself and my ancestors have always known that. Immigrants have known this in varying forms and ways. The Irish learned it, and the Catholics learned it from Ireland and across Europe, and people from South Asia and from Latin America, South and Central America have learned it. But now we are seeing in Minnesota white people, primarily of European background, and Somalis
Mm-hmm.
receiving the same kind of denunciation and condemnation by the United States leadership. This is, if not a wake-up call, this ought to be an alarming situation for all of us, and for us to rise up and say, there is no place for people to say, I'm going to sit this one out.
That's right. Well, I think that's the perfect way to end. That there is no way to there is just not a time to sit this out. One of the things I've said when people ask what can we do is I've said each of us has an area of interest, each of us has some expertise. Whatever bell you have, ring it and ring it without stopping because that's the only way I think to not forget and to raise the hope that perhaps things will change. Judge Griffen, thank you so much again for being here. This is Rational Basis. Please subscribe to us. We post this link on various social media. Hit us up, talk to us. We're happy. We'll be back next week to talk about another happy subject. We
And
hope
we
it's
do,
happier than this week. Let's
and
hope.
Dean DePepper, we do read the comments, and so we thank you for the comments.
Amen.
Keep them coming, and please give us thumbs up and share
And
the
share.
link to it so that other people will subscribe.
That's right. Thank you so much, Judge Griffen. Have a good day.
You too.